My name is Gardner, and my pronouns are she and her, or they and them. And I'm honored to get to speak to you about this topic today. I often bring up positionality to the people in my life, and the number one question is, what is that? So I'm really excited to have a chance to try to answer that question. So a little about me to start. I grew up in Oakland, and when I tell people that, they get one of two ideas in their minds. Either they imagine the Oakland lately portrayed in the media, a place full of crime and poverty, where people are increasingly turning to drugs, theft, or violence. They see a community littered with encampments where many are either eventually displaced or incarcerated. Or they think about a magical land of grassroots movements and justice work between First Friday hip-hop music and local artist collectives, of Lake Merritt and farmers markets and Telegraph Avenue, and the seemingly endless beauty between the marinas at Jack London and the redwood trees in the hills. The truth is that none of these perspectives are totally right, because actually all of them are. I grew up in a place of immense beauty and immense struggle, and both of these realities are what formed my personality and my values. But something I also learned from living in this liminal space, this place of extremes where oftentimes it is hard to pin down a definition, is that the way that people perceive my hometown, me, beauty, struggle, and actually the world as a whole is very consistent with what angle they have seen that world from. Typically, we conceptualize this as bias, the preconceptions individuals or institutions hold based on our lived systems of experience and belief. And the dangers of bias are fairly well known. In her book, Biased, Dr. Jennifer Eberhardt describes her work with police trainers, who she advises that, quote, bias, even when we are not conscious of it, has consequences that we need to understand and mitigate. The stereotypic associations we carry in our heads can affect what we perceive, how we think, and the actions we take. But what about when it isn't that simple? What if what we hold isn't so much a bias, rather a skewed self-perception based on multiple intersections of our identities and experiences which define our perspectives of where we stand? For example, I've lived a lot of life at 33. In fact, I often joke that I feel old because I've had so many different experiences, and I occupy so many different intersections that defining myself is usually hard. But I am going to try, because it is the first step in understanding the dance that is positionality. And I'm going to do this in what is actually called a positionality statement, which Leslie gave us one earlier. This is a concept that originated in the research world as putting forth information about the researcher that might influence the findings in the research itself. So here goes. I am a queer, gender nonconforming person that comes from a middle-class background. I'm an educator, a millennial, a college graduate, and I currently contend with both physical and psychiatric disabilities that affect my daily life. I identify as neurodivergent, as an agnostic, a UU, an anti-capitalist, an abuse survivor, an ally to marginalized people, and I also recognize myself as a descendant of both indigenous as immigrant people, as much as I am a racially white person. And I can see the world very clearly from all of these perspectives, but outside of them, I am limited. I do not know homelessness or family-based violence any more than I know what it means to be a person of color, developmentally disabled, a tribal member, undocumented, incarcerated, or marginalized as a result of any of these factors. Additionally, I do not know the unique struggle of coming from a family that regularly prioritizes money, status, and success over love, community, and wellness. I've heard that this comes with its own unique set of challenges. I also see the world from the point of view of a few strange intersections in my identities. For example, I am a teacher who is disabled in a few different ways. But that often means I need some of the same accommodations that I regularly provide for my students. I am a queer, non-binary person who spent time identifying as heterosexual and occupying a fairly cisnormative gender role. Also, my father is decidedly upper class while my mother continues to live near the poverty line. And I grew up simultaneously in both of those worlds. So I have the unique perspective of understanding this, even though I now have a fairly working class station. And I understand what it's like to regularly be the only white person in a room, as much as I have been in rooms where people of color are completely absent. I also know what it's like to watch other white people show disdain for undocumented immigrants without knowing that I would not be here if my great-grandparents had not crossed the border undocumented. These types of things happen when you are often standing in two worlds at once. But this is also an example of the danger of people understanding their positionality in a way that is lacking. For example, when they may be speaking directly to someone about an opinion they hold, when the person they are speaking to actually has a direct experience with it, like we saw earlier when I tried to take over Marina's Time for All Ages. Despite evidence, she was clearly best suited to the task. And honestly, since I moved away from home, I've begun to notice people misjudging their own positionality more frequently. Maybe it isn't so much that it's more common, but perhaps it's more noticeable. As I leave a place where a mishmash of experiences and cultures breed people that tend to see the world through many different lenses. After all, positionality is most often miscalculated in groups that tend to be homogenous, where people are or are perceived as one thing. The more we are around people who are the same, the more limited we become in our understanding of the breadth of human experience. In these groups or variations of them, the greatest threats to community occur when people forget not just who they are speaking to, but where they are speaking from. Some examples include white people that feel entitled to define what is or isn't racist towards people of color. Wealthy people who tell those in poverty how to become wealthy, especially when, statistically speaking, socioeconomic status is more based in intergenerational privilege than in individuals' choices. Feelings get hurt when straight people attempt to joke about queerness, especially in the presence of those who have been ridiculed and oppressed for being openly and visibly queer. Or my personal favorite is when men spell out topics that their non-male listeners are highly aware of already. You may have heard this called mansplaining before, and yes, it happens often. And yes, it is an undervaluation of how often non-male people are talked at before they are listened to. These blunders in regards to positionality might feel harmless to those perpetuating them. In fact, we all at times might even feel entitled to have opinions in the absence of direct experience. But that isn't a product of that in itself is a product of our positionality, because it means we are not used to experiencing consequences as a product of speaking up. Also, when it comes to community, misjudging our positionality and our privilege can have a devastating impact. I want to tell you a story. Last Saturday, my grandmother, my mother's mother, passed away due to a long battle with dementia. 2 days later, my mother started chemotherapy for a recurrence of her breast cancer. As I walked into my first class of the day, I teach high school, after playing the game of should I or shouldn't I go to work, I got an email praising the 8 employees who had perfect attendance this year. My positionality pushed me to have a few reactions. First, I noticed that this list was entirely male, save one employee who was still probationary. Then I considered everyone on my staff, some of whom had a chronic disability, who was taking care of sick family members or young children, who had gotten COVID simply from being at work, who was experiencing financial insecurity, burnout, struggles with mental health, or all of the above. I also considered how my workplace culture was one that condemned absences as if they were a choice instead of a necessity. And the only response I could think of was to fire off one quick pointed email about ableism and something hostile workplace environment, because from where I stood, this was just another example of our administration dehumanizing and undervaluing us. But here, my positionality also got in the way, because I was conditioned to see leadership as a monolith and inherently oppressive because power structures only serve to disenfranchise the masses, right? Wrong. Because the person I was sending the email to wasn't even in leadership. She was the office manager. And as it turned out, the email was actually meant to be internal and only congratulate those who it was for, not sent to the whole staff. It was an honest mistake. And 10 minutes later, she showed up to my room with a box of chocolates and a very sincere apology. And suddenly, I felt bad for assuming such negative intent. In actuality, we were both very interested in preserving community, but in my moment of only seeing from my position, especially in the context of my history, I didn't see a woman who, in all actuality, probably worked harder than I did most days to keep our workplace community together. So as the earlier song said, maybe I have seen 1,000 things, 1,000 lives. And maybe my perspective of myself is that I hold some high pluralistic view of the world, but in reality, I am also a little bit touched. For example, coming from a community torn apart by corrupt policing, corporate greed, and misguided local government, I have always had an inherent mistrust of authority because people in power have caused a lot of pain for myself and the people that I care about. And I still have a really hard time interacting with people who I perceive to be wealthy, able-bodied, neurotypical, straight, and cisgender, probably because I spent most of my young life being ridiculed, shamed, and mistreated by people who fit this demographic. I also watched these same people grow up into adults who never named their privileges, or if they did, masked them for the sake of avoiding accountability. I did not fit their schema of what they considered normal, and they treated that as such, and I still carry that with me. And it's true, these are all people who are on their own journey, so I try to have compassion for them as best that I can. However, maybe this is why I hold a certain amount of empathy and space for people of color who so regularly watch white people like myself speak out their own oppression when to be a person of color in this country comes with its own set of struggles and difficulties that no amount of empathy will allow any white person to fully comprehend. In fact, my oldest friend often rehashes how I, as a queer person, and her as a Black woman, both have had to combat perceptions in order to be allowed to authentically exist, and how this brings us closer, even though our stories are very different. I understand the irony of this. As I stand up here speaking on this topic, and the lack of Black and brown voices in this conversation is not lost on me. From where I stand, I can talk about my own oppression in all of its nuances, but I can also see a gaping hole in the opportunities given to Black and brown voices to express their experiences honestly. It almost gives me a reason to want to step away, as I recognize myself as part of this larger problem. But because I'm already here, I want to use this opportunity to instead bring those voices into the conversation, to use my platform for that purpose. So for this, I'd like to invite Audre Lorde, Black queer feminist speaker and author, to define the importance of positionality for all of us. In her essay, Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference, Lorde writes, "Certainly, there are very real differences between us of age, race, and sex. But it is not those differences between us that are separating us. It is rather our refusal to recognize these differences and to evaluate the distortions which result from our misnaming them and their effects upon human behavior and expectation." She goes on to say, "It is a lifetime pursuit for each of us to extract these distortions from our living at the same time as we recognize, reclaim, and define these differences upon which they are imposed. For we have been raised in a society where these differences were endemic within our living. Too often we pour the energy needed for recognizing and exploring difference into pretending these differences are either insurmountable variables or that they do not exist at all. This results in a voluntary isolation or false and treacherous connections. Either way, we do not develop tools for using human difference as a springboard for creative change within our lives. So yes, we are part of a faith that values and celebrates togetherness and the embrace of a community that attempts to eradicate barriers. We might just want to hold hands, stand in a circle, and call it a day. But if we come at this work without recognizing who we are, before we approach the lived experience of others, are we truly building community? If we cannot look ourselves in the mirror and see both our privilege and oppression for what they are, how are we accurately able to assess both our responsibilities and our needs within that community? If we are not listening to the needs of others as much as we express our own needs, are we really sharing in this work? Are we doing what is best for everyone, or just what is best for everyone like us? Lorde also mentions this when she emphasizes how necessary it is for her to see herself for who she is as she expresses her identity within community. She says, "As a Black lesbian feminist comfortable with the many different ingredients of my identity, and a woman committed to racial and sexual freedom from oppression, I find that I'm constantly being encouraged to pluck out some aspect of myself and present this as a meaningful whole, eclipsing or denying the other parts of self. But this is as destructive and fragmenting as a way to live. My fullest concentration of energy is available to me only when I integrate all parts of who I am." This makes sense to me, because as someone who has lived many lives and stood in many places, I don't think it would be fair to only see me as a queer person or a young person or a teacher or a white person, disabled person, a person who sometimes sends impulsive emails. I am all of these things in constant conversation, just as perhaps the people that I instinctively view as privileged may have elements of their identity that I could benefit from learning from. So then, what do we do about the fact that our positions might be influencing us to cause harm? Is this just a constant game of tug-of-war between the identities of the people we share space with? I don't think so. Because if we're constantly doing this math problem of who most needs to be acknowledged in every interaction, we sacrifice valuable opportunities for authentic connection. We also risk undervaluing our own narratives because we fear that they'll invalidate others. This is not the goal any more than it is something that anyone can do perfectly. However, it is important to look at both where we come from and where we are going as we do this work. In fights for racial justice, those who have suffered racial oppression must be elevated, and their complaints should be heard. In work towards battling inequities, we must consider who is most impacted by the absence of justice and include those stories that are currently missing from the conversation. When we are challenged by others in our communities, we must look for the places that they are coming from to better assess where they stand and what it might require of us to walk alongside them. And if people who hold privilege are able to own and utilize their real and tangible gifts, this actually puts resources into fighting for social justice. And it can be some of the most powerful tools in reaching the ears and hearts of oppressive institutions. Lorde herself admitted this is true, and I have to say that I agree. Because as distrustful as I am of wealth and its roots in privilege, I'm also immensely grateful and reverent of those who use that same privilege to feed homeless youth, or donate to arts scholarships, or throw block parties for their HOA to raise money for humanitarian aid in Gaza. Our positionality can be our struggle, but it can also be our greatest blessing. So as we go forward, maybe this is the lesson. The goal of recognizing positionality is not to decide who is more worthy of respect. Because, and I mean this, everyone is worthy of respect. But the work of positionality is recognizing who would most benefit from acknowledgement and who would most benefit from deference and humility in any given community effort. Just as I recognize that perhaps I should be at the center of discussions about maybe queer programming or advocacy for young adults, I'm probably the wrong person to weigh in on, I don't know, how to organize a Super Bowl party. Like, what even is football? And while I may stand by and support movements for justice on behalf of others, I should definitely not be the person who my white colleagues sometimes come to and ask me if things are racist. They know I grew up in Oakland, but I can only answer that question based on my adjacency to certain communities, not as members of them. My positionality limits my perspective. However, this is not a social deficiency or something that can or even should be surmounted. It is an understanding that allows me to know when it is my time to stand up and my time to step back, because I can only see through my own eyes and stand in my own shoes. And to do that comfortably, those shoes have to fit, and I have to wear them. And sure, I have walked down many roads and been in many communities, and sure, I have done quite a bit of living, and that might make me feel old at times, but I'm not. As many of you who are older than me probably acknowledged and even scoffed at when I said something along the lines of, I feel old. I have a lot of privilege in that just being a feeling and not a lived reality. But hey, that was me being unable to imagine and acknowledge my own positionality in the context of this community. So I'm sorry. I will try to do better, just like I all hope we can. I hope we all can. Because the way we show up and engage with each other in this beautiful struggle of creating lasting bonds, both because of our differences and in spite of them, depends on it. Thank you.